You're listening to the Vent Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Vent Podcast. My name is Billy Galenko, and today we are talking about one of my favorite topics, or I guess multiple favorite topics in wine. It is number one. We have a medium-sized importer on the episode, and I love supporting anyone who's basically going out and seeking wines of their passion and trying to distribute them in the United States. So it's really exciting to have Sebastian Lova, which I think you pronounce it in German, from Baire Wines on the podcast today. He comes on to talk about his import company, which is called Baire Wines. He explains why it's called Baire on the episode. He is an importer that he and his wife focus on German and Austrian wines. And what I'm really excited about this is everybody's mind goes immediately to maybe certain varieties when they think of Germany or Austria. Probably everybody thinks of Riesling with Germany, and maybe for Austria, your mind might go to Grüner, Veltliner. But what I really like about his whole portfolio is they support small producers who focus on really unique varieties. Some of my favorite varieties, some of the varieties that I seek out that I don't think are really in the US enough. I brought up this book multiple times. I also am hoping to get him on the podcast someday. Jason Wilson, if you're listening, he wrote Godforsaken Grapes, which I have right here, my copy of. That is what actually got me first really turned on to Austrian wines when I was in my earlier wine life. He has a couple chapters in here where he just goes and tastes with different producers in Austria, and goes and tastes in Vienna as well, which actually has vineyards within the capital. I think I've probably mentioned that on the podcast, but in the city limits, lots of vineyards. So he got me really into these different varieties, things I'd never heard before. Really, at that time, I hadn't really tried many like Zweigelts and Blaufränkisch, which we'll touch on here in a minute. But then he goes on to talk about things like Zierfandler and Blauberger and different varieties that to this day I still have only had maybe once or twice. And that was only because I went to Austria and purposely sought some of these out. So what I want to touch on before we get to our interview with Sebastian, which is really interesting, it gives you really an insight into what it's like to be a small to mid-size importer, the freedom that it gives you to choose producers that you feel like you have a good connection with, how to seek out quality wines, and how to really tell their stories. I find it fascinating. I actually met Sebastian at a tasting with one of his producers. He was actually nice enough. It was a wine bar and it was really crowded, and the producer was serving behind the bar, and he actually got up and let me have his seat and stood while my fiance sat down and I stood next to her. I was really grateful for him for that, and I'm really excited to be able to tell the story of Baire Wines on this podcast. But like I said, before we get there, let's talk about German and Austrian varieties outside of what everybody thinks of. A lot of these, some people get intimidated because some of them have umlaut, like those two dots above the U's, or they just have many syllables in their names. But I'm going to start with probably what's a little more well-known, and then we'll move out a little bit further from that. So a couple varieties I want to start with will be white varieties. We'll just start with white in general. And in Germany, what people don't really know maybe as much, they plant all sorts of varieties, including French varieties. Included in Sebastian's portfolio, they have some amazing Chardonnays, some Sauvignon Blanc that are really top quality. They grow in certain areas, and especially as they're further in the south, places like Baden get definitely warm enough, and then there's definitely a lot of regions in the Pfalz and certain other areas where these wines are grown, and they produce spectacular wines. I recommend checking out Baire Wines' website to learn more about some of their producers that grow them. But so there is like Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc that is grown in Germany. But there are also varieties like Weißburgunder and Grauburgunder. And you might think those are weird names. Those are just their words for calling Pinot Blanc and Pinot Gris. Weiss is white, and Burgunder is just the ending they put on there. So Weißburgunder just means Pinot Blanc, the equivalent. And Grauburgunder, Grau means gray. So same thing as Pinot Gris. So there are some excellent expressions of those in Germany. I've had some amazing Weißburgunder that are just super lean and beautiful in terms of their minerality, and I really like a lot of them. And then I think a couple other varieties that people really might not think of as much in Germany, and also in Austria, are varieties like Schreube, Cschreube. I hope that's spelled right. I can pull it up here. That is a really interesting variety that I've had in a multitude of styles. I've had both more traditionally a clean, lean white style. And I've also had it in a skin contact style, which is really good. And I've really enjoyed that a lot. Another one I really enjoyed that was originally a crossing that was meant to be a higher producing Riesling variety. It was Müller-Thurgau. This wine was a crossing of Riesling and Madeleine Royale, with the idea that you were going to have a really high producing vine with all of the richness and quality of Riesling. And it certainly doesn't taste exactly or that close to Riesling in my mind, but it can produce when it's not, when the yields are managed and the wine is really taken care of. It can produce a really clean, crisp, and depending on where it's grown, like a mineral driven white wine. But I've seen it make some really excellent, and my favorite expression tends to be more skin contact, where they really get this kind of depth, almost sometimes a little bit of smokiness, but it's really just this kind of nuance and depth that I don't think Müller-Thurgau gets on its own, typically in just the larger mass-produced white expressions that you see. A couple other varieties that I want to touch on. Silvaner is another great white grape grown both in Germany and in Austria. This wine, basically, the grapes it kind of produces, it's a difficult to grow grape. So you don't see it a ton, but it's always very lean to me. So people get like passion fruit notes, but I always get this kind of like herbaceous, almost spice with it. And I think it's a really interesting wine worth seeking out. It's similar sometimes in my head to Grüner, if you get a spicy Grüner, but I think it's an amazing wine to seek out as well. Wrapping up here, let me see if I missed any of the white varieties that I really wanted to hit on. I don't think so. I'll probably circle back as I always do. Now let's move on to white varieties that I think are really interesting. And these are by no means an exhaustive list. There's tons of these. Like there are also other really cool varieties in Austria, like Zierfandler and some other things that I didn't really get into. And I highly recommend everybody kind of digging in a little bit more. When it comes to the red varieties, though, let's start with probably one, or I guess we'll start in Austria. We'll go with two, Blaufränkisch and Zweigelt. Zweigelt is actually, I believe to this day still, the second most planted most grape in Austria, just behind Grüner. So I think that's really interesting. Zweigelt is a crossing of Saint Laurent and Blaufränkisch, which is really interesting. Saint Laurent is another grape I recommend seeking out. It's actually spelled Sankt, but you can just say Saint Laurent and people will know what you mean. It's a light body, red fruit forward, very similar to a Pinot Noir. And that was blended with crossed with Blaufränkisch, which is again high acid, but it can have quality tannins. My buddy here, Jason Wilson, says a lot of Blaufränkisch can remind him even of a Barolo. So that gives you a sense of some of the tannins that can happen in the acid levels in Blaufränkisch. So Zweigelt makes the best of both worlds. It's really always bright fruit, very approachable, but there's always solid acid. You'll see a lot of, especially in the US, come across a lot of rosés made from Zweigelt, and they're never flabby and drab. They're very bright and lean and very linear, perfect with food. But again, they also make a beautiful, easy to drink, really nice chilled red wine. So Stiegert Zweigelt, it's also called Rotberger. There's a long story behind that. The guy who Zweigelt was named after may or may not have worked in the wine program under the Nazis. So he's not really looked upon fondly as a person. So the name was actually changed, I believe, in the 60s or something from Rotberger to Zweigelt. So there's also talks about changing it back. But the grape itself is a really interesting variety. Blaufränkisch, one of my favorite red grapes in the world. Amazing acid. I tend to like acid in my red wines. Amazing acid, ability to age, especially when taken care of in the winery and in the vineyard. You can get some wines with amazing depth, complexity, ability to age. I just recommend trying Zweigelt whenever you can, seeking it out, especially if you like more of like a nice high acid structured red wine in that way. Maybe more if you're more of a Pinot person. If you're like a 15.5 Zinfandel person, I don't know if this will necessarily be up your alley, but I love them. A couple other ones. First, there's one from Germany that everybody should know, Spätburgunder. And again, you hear the Burgunder, so you think it might be one of these Pinot grapes. It is literally Pinot Noir, or not literally. Spät means late in German, or the Spät on the word, so it's late Burgundy, but it is Pinot Noir. And I highly, highly recommend people seek out Pinot Noir. When I first started studying for the wine programs, even my interest in certified sommelier exams, I was listening to a podcast that had been made 5 to 7 years before that even. And it was Varieties or Thies talking about how he was discovering the quality of Spätburgunder and how good these Pinot Noirs were. And he was mentioning one producer, I can't remember who it was right now, who was trading a barrel a year of his Spätburgunder with the Domaine de la Romanée-Conti for their Romanée-Conti Pinot Noir, which this has always stuck with me because he noted in the podcast, and I was too young into my wine journey at the time to understand what he meant. And he said they traded a barrel of this wine for Romanée-Conti. And I was like, why is he saying Romanée-Conti twice? I've since obviously learned it was DRC's Romanée-Conti. They were talking about the vineyard and the producer, but I thought that was hilarious. But that's always made me keep an eye out for German Spätburgunder, and they have only gotten better. This is one wine that is, regardless of what your opinion is on climate change, as the vintages have gotten warmer and warmer in Germany, this is one variety, and the regions that are growing these, especially in Baden, have gotten better and better. So I highly recommend seeking out German Spätlese, Spätburgunder, if you can. A couple other ones that I think are really interesting that are German red varieties. Let's see. He mentions Trollinger, or I don't know how to say it properly in German, Trollinger in the podcast. I think that's an awesome, to me, sometimes spicy a little bit, like a smoky a little bit, but it's also always very fruit forward. It's a cool balance wine. And there's also Dornfelder, which is an interesting variety. I actually had an American Dornfelder recently that was very good. But this is a really approachable, and it's a really great, easy drinker red wine. I also like it chilled, but it has some spices. It has some dark fruit, flowers. So I definitely recommend you find and just try a bunch of these different red varieties. I know there are a lot that I certainly didn't touch on, but I want to make sure I got the highlights of the ones that I was trying to get to. So main takeaway for everyone is just go seek out, especially Austrian and German wines, but German outside of Riesling. Try to break out of that. Austria is making some amazing wines from all throughout the country. Red wines, white wines. They're also making some amazing Sauvignon Blanc in like Steiermark, like further down in the southeast, I guess that would be. And of course, they're making great Grüner and Rieslings. Everybody go seek out German and Austrian wines. And without going into any further elaboration here, we're going to get to our interview with Sebastian Lova of Baire Wines. He not only imports German and Austrian wines, but they're also low intervention German and Austrian wines. I think everybody's heard us talk about on the podcast a lot, natural wines. This kind of helps shed some light on what this means. They're not bringing in these wines that are made just to look skin contacty and have a cool label on them, although some of them do have cool labels. These are basically wines that are so meticulously cared for in the vineyards, and that just leads to, in the winery, they don't really have to do that much to produce a great wine. And we talk about it in the podcast. There's not a lot of corrections, additions, anything that needs to be done in the winery per se. So it's hopefully going to give you a little more sense of what it means to be a low intervention wine, and hopefully get you really excited for just seeking out German and Austrian wines. Without further ado, here is our interview with wine importer Sebastian Lova. Hi, Sebastian. Thanks so much for joining today.
Hey, Billy. Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited you were able to join us, and the wines we tasted from that one producer were really good. I'm really excited to learn a little bit about how you got into the importation game, and then we'll explain to our listeners a little bit more about how you get in contact with these producers and really spread the good word.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I think you came out to Covell, to the Lucas Kraus event, one of our producers from the Pfalz. It's always fun when producers come out to visit and can see, first of all, people can meet them, but also they can see what the US market is, because it's just so different than from what they know at home. But yeah, I'm together with my wife, I have a company called Baire Wines Imports, and we focus on organic and biodynamically farmed wines from Germany and Austria. The name is a funny brainchild of mine. So my name is Sebastian, but the nickname for Sebastian in Germany, where I'm from, is Basti, and my wife's name is Claire, and Basti and Claire together is Baire. But also I'm from Berlin, Germany, and Claire's from California. We both have a bear on the flag.
Oh.
And yeah, so we like the bears. But then I guess the triple pun is bare, as in bare naked, because as I mentioned, all the wines are farmed consciously, either organic or biodynamic, and then also in the cellar with low intervention, nothing really added to the wines, but maybe some sulfurate bottling. So that's how the name Baire kind of came to light. I woke up one morning and was like, bam, it makes sense. And 4.5 years in, I still don't hate it, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, definitely a good sign. So how did you get in? Did you like always have wine as a calling? Growing up in Germany, I assume you drank wine fairly often, maybe.
Funny that you say it, because actually not. Growing up in Germany, definitely the relationship with alcohol is a little bit different than in the US. You know, you can drink beer and wine when you're 16 legally, but mostly you probably start a little bit sooner than that. But for me, it was always more actually beer. And being from Berlin, you are removed from like the wine growing regions for sure. And also beer, to buy beer is like cheaper than buying a bottled water or something like that in Germany. So it was always beer. And then when I moved to the US when I was 22, I had a big shock when I saw all these IPAs and everything. And it was just like, what is that? Can I just have a Pilsner? What's going on? That was the time when like IPAs were huge and they needed to be like as crazy and as big as possible, more alcohol, more intense. And I was just like, holy crap, what's going on? Whereas just beer flavored beer. But so wine never really played a role for me. Honestly, I thought for a long time that I'm like allergic and I didn't like wine. It would give me headaches and just never really had like good experiences. But based on what I just said, that beer is cheaper than water, I applied the same kind of mentality to wine. So the wine that I was drinking when I was young was definitely not the best, probably with a bunch of crazy additives in it. And those probably more so gave me a headache or just irresponsible drinking when you're young. But that being said, actually, my wife was the one who got me into drinking some wine originally. And we would move here to California. We would go camping a lot. I would bring beers, but they couldn't be cold for long enough. And so I would also have like maybe a flask of whiskey or something. And at the same time, my wife sits around the fire, drinks like a nice Pinot Noir or something. And she's joined me when drinking the wine. I'm like, no, I don't really want to. Eventually, she did lull me over and we went on some trips up to Santa Barbara to go to some wine tastings and visit some wineries, and kind of like started planting that seed in me. But it took a trip to Italy actually for a honeymoon, and where we spent 1 week in Tuscany. And basically for 1 week, every day we went to different wineries to taste. And it was eye-opening then that in a region that is so strict based on everything is Sangiovese, to be able to be Chianti Classico, it has to be aged this way, etc. Like there's such a rigorous kind of rules around how to make the wine that you can have a different experience in every winery that you go into with different flavors. And we have this soil here with our expedition is to the north, ours to the south. And I was like, wait a minute, there's so many aspects to wine that are so different than a product that you just buy on shelf. Combine that with the family history, the farming aspect, it really just hit me too. Wine is an agricultural product. It's not a manufactured good in a sense. And from that day on, I really got the bug and was like, every book that I'm reading is about wine. Every movie that I watch is about wine. Whenever we travel to a wine region or at least combine it in some way. At that time, Claire and I actually moved to Germany, like after we got married, so that she could spend some time with my family too. And she learned the language. And so we were very close to a lot of wine regions in Europe, right? So we would maybe visit Paris, but I was like, if we go to Paris, we also have to go to Sancerre and those kind of little trips. And yeah, and it really took me, I'm a little bit of an obsessive person too. So when I like something, then I really get into it. Hence, I recently started playing soccer with some friends and I'm sitting here with my all wrapped up because I got injured yesterday because get into things a little too much. But yeah, wine was just so fascinating to me and I actually wanted to make wine. And that was the jumping off point to then importing wines. Fast forward, moving away from Germany back to California. I was like, how can I make this my life? I really want to make wine. I bought some grapes from, actually they came from Oregon, I think, frozen must, and made some wine in my garage. You could barely call it wine. I made alcohol, let's say. Didn't taste great, but I went through a whole fermentation process and everything and was super fascinated. Oh, like I understand it so much more. I went through that process once and just on a whim then signed up to 2 tons of fruit from a vineyard up in Santa Barbara. I had no idea where I was going to make it or really anything, but was just like jumping headfirst into it. And at that time, and Claire curses herself for saying things out loud because then I just make them happen. She was like, you make a little bit of wine, you have to sell it too. And there's all these wines that we found in Germany and Austria that we love, but no one is importing them. Maybe we should be doing it. Maybe we should bring in the wine. And if you have to sell your own wine anyway, sell other people's wine too. Why not? And I was like, great idea. And so that's kind of the long, short version.
Nice. I just realized from the very beginning, I'm probably not only, but one of the only people who thinks about Germans growing up drinking wine instead of beer. I think it's most common for everybody thinking about beer in the first place. That shows I've been studying wine too much. Now that I know now that I know Germans drink the most sparkling wine per capita of anybody, I'm just assume everybody's just drinking sparkling wine.
There's a lot of sparkling wine being drank too, but also a lot on the €2 category with plastic cork and questionable methods of making it.
Oh yeah.
That's the kind of stuff that I grew up with. But yeah, I contributed to the sparkling wine sales for sure.
Nice. Yeah. So your story or your path at least really resonates with me because I got into wine later in my later 20s and I just took the intro to sommelier exam on a whim, and the same thing. When I get really into something, I got into something. I took that exam and then ended up quitting my job and going to work a harvest in Australia and have been in wine ever since. So I like that story. I think sometimes people think you need to grow up in wine and have your parents to like really end up appreciating it. But I think you're a great example of why you don't.
Yeah, and I don't have the more trained background too, like you. Like I didn't do any sommelier training or something, so I don't even think you necessarily need that to be successful or to be like passionate and work in wine. Obviously, that helps. Sure. But I also think it's amazing that you are not only doing that, but you also did harvest, because then sometimes I feel like that portion is missing too. And that's probably the most important, to like actually step into a vineyard and a winery and understand what's going on there.
Yeah.
It all learned so much in books, but you learn the most by drinking the stuff and visiting with people that make it and maybe even get your hands dirty too.
That's my thinking. Where did you end up, before we get into more about your portfolio, where did you end up putting those 2 tons and making that wine?
I had a small wine label for 2 years. It's a little bit on hold right now because Baire Wines is a little bit like, I'm too busy with Baire Wines basically. But yeah, the first year we made 3 different cuvées under a label called Fernweh Wines. And then that was 2020. And then in 21, we did 6 different wines. We actually upped the production to 6 tons, and we made it at a custom crush winery up in Camarillo here. That was a good thing. I found a place where you can just go in and make the wine with the people. I didn't have to invest in their own space. And obviously that's very complicated with licensing and stuff, which is something interesting to talk about too when it comes to distribution, but maybe we get to that later.
Yeah. But I was just curious if you did custom crush or if you rented a pod moving unit and just had a big tub outside your house or something.
No, I actually recently got rid of all my 5-gallon glass jars and stuff that I still had in the closet right behind me here, because that was not really safe anymore.
Yeah, carboys, I think they're called.
Yeah, carboys. Yeah,
I have no idea why people. I'm sure there's a bootlegger term for that. Yeah, when I first moved to Los Angeles after working in the vintage, I just bought 100 pounds of Zinfandel and made 1 carboy in my apartment. So when my fiance met me, she just came in and there was this big jug of purple juice. She's it was in the fridge at the time. It was cold settling. She's like, "What is this?" I still have 6 bottles over here. So We'll see. And they're now 5 years old. So I'm interested to see what they'll taste like. But
yeah, that project is unfortunately a little bit on hold for us, but we did plant a small vineyard here in LA, in West Hills in the San Fernando Valley, of Sangiovese, bring it back to the original story. And nice. So those vines are 3 years old now. It's a very small vineyard. We're going to make 1 barrel out of it.
Yeah.
It's like 420 vines. But yeah, we're going to have LA County, Sangiovese, hopefully pressed in a barrel this fall.
That's
It's
awesome.
kind of going to be like a little homage to like my whole path to finding to wine. And again, to that point, yes, we bought fruit before, worked with like biodynamic vineyards to get fruit, but we really wanted to get our hands even dirtier. So we're like, okay, maybe we have this opportunity. Let's even plant a small vineyard and do everything from pruning to shoot thinning to harvest.
Nice.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to go check that out. Yeah. My Zinfandel, I was helping pick a vineyard that's like up by Santa Clarita, and it was helping a guy with Grenache at the time. But cool. I really want to go visit that now. But pivoting back, so since you are German, so I guess that's how you got into like German wines. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, your portfolio, you kind of balance, and then the key varieties? Because your producers don't only focus on what people typically think of when they think of just Germany and Austria. They have a whole mix. So I'd love for you to share that with everybody.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Of course, the natural path was I just love German and Austrian wine too. That's maybe I'm biased. Maybe there's a bias in my blood somehow, but I just like the higher acid, fresher wines, a little bit lower alcohol, and just more easy drinking, for lack of a better term, than compared to like wines from hotter regions where you have more alcohol, big, bold flavors. And so I always just felt gravitated towards that. But then why it makes the most sense too is just the connection from speaking the same language, having grown up in the same environment and with the same culture, because you can really connect so much more with the winemakers. I think we consider all of them our dear friends. We go visit them at least once a year or sometimes twice, hang out with their kids, walk their dogs. Like it's a very friendly relationship. And so if I would be running around in France trying to buy wine, I would be like I cannot express my feelings and everything in French like I can in German. Mm-hmm. And the same for the winemakers too. I love that our winemakers can be a true representation of themselves and just be 100% themselves, because as soon as they have to, even though their English, for some of their English, like for some people, their English is amazing. For some, it's not as good, but we could also totally communicate in English, of course. But once you have to speak a foreign language, you're going to lose a little bit of yourself in a way. And we love the fact that we can go there and they can be 100% themselves and speak about them and their wines in their own language.
How did you first meet them? Was it like friends of friends? Did one tell another person, or like how did it start?
There's a little bit of everything like that. So the first producer that we ever had in our portfolio, it was like that classic old school story of driving around and seeing this. Basically, we were on vacation in Austria. This was before we even thought we would have a wine company or anything like that. And we just stumbled upon this building on the side of this like hillside. And it looked really interesting. It had a sign on the door where it said 0% chance rain, 99% chance wine, 1% chance gin. And we're like, that sounds cool. Let's go inside. Let's see what's going on. And it happened to be a tasting room from this one winemaker. And I think we were there. This was in South Styria, Austria. Mm-hmm. We were there for 3 days, and I think we went there 4 times in those 3 days because we just loved it so much. We kept coming back for the wine, and they made like beautiful little cheese boards and stuff too, and got really friendly with the people. And they were definitely always in the back of our mind. Man, these wines are so cool. Like, why aren't those wines in the US? And they were then that catalyst of maybe we should bring producers like that over here. But that was like the most romantic story, because you drive around the countryside and you're like, oh, let's stop here. And it ended up being our first producer that we ever imported.
Wow.
That being said, others we maybe found through Instagram, literally just like scrolling. You see something, oh, this looks really cool. What? They're farming with the use of horses only. They don't have a tractor. It's amazing. Let me write him and be like, hey, what's up? I would love to come by and taste with you because what you do looks really cool and interesting. And I would love to try your wines. So there's stories like that. There's other stories, like you said, where it's more of a recommendation, basically. Like we taste with one person and they're like, oh, you have to check out my friend too. He's just up the road. they call him up. He's, yeah, I have time. We drive over and then boom, we have an amazing afternoon together and started working together and never look back. It can kind of come from a lot of different ways, but it typically happens pretty organically and naturally. And you can like almost always tell by the first communication, like if it's going to work or not, because we're definitely in it for the people too. I always say now, like owning my own company, I only want to work with people that I would also go out and have dinner with.
Yeah.
And that has some like that goes to obviously our producers, like there, it really needs to be like that because we're building like a little Baire Wines family. And I want to be 100% behind the people that I represent. And that also goes to people that we sell to. And because otherwise I could have stayed at my job before if I wanted to work with people that I don't like and probably make more money. So yeah, you can kind of like feel it out pretty fast. And I think there's a little bit like someone could pour me the best wine that I ever tasted, but if that person is a dick, I probably won't buy it. Like it just, that has to work too.
That makes complete sense. Yeah, for sure.
And our portfolio is pretty small too. Like we only have 14 producers, so everything is pretty tight knit.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about the wines? I know it's everybody makes their own specific things, but broad strokes, can you talk a little bit about the wines that each producer kind of brings in?
Yeah, I think I'm going to latch on to something that you said earlier, where you said there's an expectation of what German wine and Austrian wine is for most people. And especially for people that don't have that much experience with it, I think the first thing that comes to mind with Germany is sweet Riesling. But maybe the first thing that comes to mind with Austria is Grüner, which that's obviously, those varietals are widely planted there. But that's definitely not everything there is. I think in our portfolio right now, with our 6 Austrian producers, we have 1 Grüner Veltliner. And there's times it's that one, like it's literally just one bottle. If that one is sold out, then we just don't have any. And with Riesling, it's a little bit different. I just love Riesling and we definitely have a lot of Riesling. But also that's definitely a mission of ours to showcase what else does Germany and Austria have to offer. We have Sauvignon Blanc from Germany. We have beautiful Chardonnay. We have traditional method sparkling wine that is made like champagne with Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier. We even have Syrah from Germany. There's such a wide range. And then obviously other varietals too, that Germany is pretty big on creating new varietals, has always been big in doing new crossings, creating new varietals. And now the focus is really on what they call over there PV varietals, PIWI, which stands for fungus resistant varietals, basically, where they cross European vines, Vitis vinifera, with more resistant varietals that are native to America or Asia, basically to give you the flavor of European varietals that you're used to, but you get the resistancy of those more hardy varietals. So basically they're resistant to mildew, which is one thing that you have to spray a lot for in a vineyard, especially in more rainy regions, which basically like a rot on the bunches.
Mm-hmm.
And with climate change in mind, and also with just the desire of being more and more sustainable in vineyards, there's a lot of focus pushed on to those varietals. And even though that doesn't sound like so much, but 3% of all vineyards are now planted to those hybrid varietals in Germany.
Oh, wow.
Which 3%, it's not so much, but if you think like that includes conventional wineries, etc., like it's a pretty massive step forward for sure. And so we work with producers that work with those varietals also. So, there's, for example, like a varietal called Sauvignac. There's going to be things like when you turn around our labels and you read the varietals, maybe you've never heard of these, which is fine. But so I guess it really ranges from, yes, we have classic like Mosel Riesling, but hey, let's have a more Burgundian Chardonnay from the Pfalz, to here's a petnat from a varietal called Muscat-Trollinger, and everything in between, really showing like a great breadth of varietals and styles of wine too.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Yeah, and when I'm trying to think of other use, I don't know if the Muscat-Trollinger it's a crossing between the two, but then there's also like Müller-Thurgau and a few others that when you say crossings, those are the first ones that come to mind. I didn't think that they were actually making like hybrids as well. I probably should have assumed, but that's really interesting that that's catching on so quickly.
Yeah, totally. And Germany is like the kind of leader when it comes to that. But unfortunately, that stuff is moving super slow. Like from making that first crossing, like at a university, to actually seeing a wine like that planted is about 20 years.
Wow. What's
So
the university called again? Is it like Geisenheim or?
There's Geisenheim and a couple of others too that focus on that. But Geisenheim is like the big one and the prestige university for enology in Germany. Yes.
So when you're, and I eventually want to, I think a lot of our listeners will be wanting us to get to the low intervention natural conversation soon. But how do you, when you're trying to go into some of these wine shops, are you purposely picking places like you mentioned earlier that are already primed for some of these German varieties? Like when you bring in a Blaufränkisch and a Zweigelt, it's not their first one from Austria and then something else from Germany. Are you purposely targeting these types of places, or are you finding yourself having to explain first what the variety is and then
those places out? If I see a wine list and I'm like, oh my God, they would totally love our wines here. Like we had this conversation before when we met at the bar too. But no, I also see it as a selling point if they don't, because hey, you are totally missing on a whole category. Let me show you what other cool stuff there is outside of France and Spain and California, for example. Some places you just never get in. I'm not going to an Italian restaurant that has a pure Italian list. That just doesn't make sense. But I think we're trying to be very diverse, and I'm not going to close myself to an account to where from the outside looking in, you might think, oh, our wines maybe don't work here, because I truly believe I have wines for everyone, from very easy, classic, true to varietal wines to then the little bit more out there wines that are like orange wines, pet nats, etc. That maybe don't fit in every account, but then maybe that very classic wine doesn't fit in the account that only wants the more like natural side of things. So we're trying to be diverse in that perspective too, that we can have wines for pretty much any account. You can find our wines from Michelin-star restaurants to our distributor in Oklahoma, for example. He sells our wines also in liquor stores, because that's where people buy wine in those states. And I don't think one or the other placement is better or more important. I want them to be like in as many places and in front of as many people as possible. And I think you can't really achieve that if you're only working with Michelin-star restaurants. You can't achieve that if you're only in the cool natural wine bars of LA. You have to be a little bit more diverse if you want to make sure lots of people get to try your wines.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I remember when I was studying years ago, there was an interview with, I guess one of the older German importers. He was like a guy who jump-started the importation, Rudi Wiest, or Weist, I don't know how to say his name. And he was saying how much education needed to happen. And he was selling really traditional things. So he's trying to explain the predicate system and stuff. So I think, number one, that interview was from like 20 years ago. And number two, I think I think we're at a different time and you're just selling a different wine where you don't have to lean on all of those formalities. You're selling a wine that speaks for itself rather than a classification system.
Totally, yeah. That's definitely more our vibe and the vibe of most of our producers. I don't think we have any wine, honestly, that is in the predicate system. Like we have Qualitätswein, which is like basically almost like the lowest step of that. Because in Germany, it's just weird without going too much into it, but that really does not have to do so much with quality of wine. It's all based on like sugar levels at harvest. Hence, Germany was so famous for the sweet wines and Auslese, etc., because those were supposed to be the prestige wines. We have a lot of producers that work completely outside of that system and are just labeling their wine as Landwein, like country wine, basically, to not play in that game. And also, once a wine is like unfiltered, it's probably not gonna get the quality wine designation, because in Germany, all the wine still has to be like literally sent in to these judges, for lack of better words, that will taste the wines. And then if you pass, we'll give you like an AP number for the wine. And if you don't, then you're only Landwein, basically, which comes with certain things. Like you cannot call out certain vineyard sites. When you're going even lower and you're just Deutscher Wein, so just German wine, you can't even say the region where it's from or the varietal. But then, yeah, we do come to that territory that you said the wine just has to speak for itself, right? And you don't sell based on GG Großes Gewächs and it's from this amazing vineyard site or something. Between us, I could tell you some of those wines actually come from those vineyard sites that you can just not call it out. But yeah, I think our portfolio is playing a little bit outside of that somewhat archaic system, how it works in Germany, where it's really not so much about ethnicity and region and was all about must weight and sugar levels at harvest, which to me doesn't even really make sense. And luckily, Austria went away from that a little bit of time ago now, but they had like a similar system to Germany before. That being said, there's always explanation involved. One good thing, and that comes again with me being from Germany and the language, is even just trying to explain how to say these things correctly,
right?
Which I'm not a stickler for that. Obviously, German language is hard, and then throw some umlauts in there. Just do your best. But I just know our buyers, or also if I work in an event or something, they think that's helpful to hear it from like a native speaker.
Yeah, I might agree with them. Sometimes I learn how to say a lot of words a lot better just listening to you. But so let's go on now. You mentioned earlier it's low intervention wines. I feel like on the podcast, like the natural wine, quote unquote, natural wine movement has come up like a number of times. So let's talk about like how your producers make their wine and why natural wine bars do view your wine as something they would sell, but also why it's just, they're still really well-made wines, and they break that stigma of natural wine is basically just something people didn't take a lot of care of in the winery and just pushed out really quickly in a pretty label.
Which that does exist, but
yeah.
No. Yeah. For us, what's really the most important thing is farming. So organic and biodynamic farming without the use of synthetic pesticides and fungicides in the vineyard is very important to us, and soil health and everything that comes with it. So many times I have these conversations with people that like, yeah, of course I buy my produce at the farmer's market, but then they buy like a $3 bottle of wine from the grocery store afterwards. And I'm like, how do these, and this is why I needed to visit wineries too, for me to make that connection. Like, oh, this is agriculture. And yes, you can see the difference if you look at a conventionally farmed vineyard where everything in between the rows is brown and dead and really compact soil. And but if you pick that up, it's like dust and no living thing in there. Or you look over there and there's a maybe organic or biodynamic vineyard next to it with like cover crops in between the rows that is like knee high, and there's animals running around. There's a bunch of bugs. If you pick up the dirt, there's actually earthworms in there. But just even from without getting too much into climate change and sustainability, etc., that's just a more beautiful sight. That's where I want to be. That's where I want to hang out. That's where I want to walk around in, not in this vineyard that has been sprayed to death, basically, with just to control the weeds. And it's easier if I just spray the stuff. And so everything dies with it besides my precious vine. And so that's kind of where it starts for us when thinking about wines and the wines that we choose and the wines that we like to drink. And typically that goes hand in hand with then also doing less in the cellar, because you're working so hard to create this beautiful vineyard, to have really healthy soils, to have healthy vines producing good fruit. Why would you then bring that juice in the cellar and then add acidifiers or whatever to manipulate the wine? And so basically what sets our producers apart from quote unquote conventional winemakers would be, yes, they don't add anything to the wines. It's fermented with native yeast that come from their cellar, from their vineyard. They basically don't add any commercial yeast. That there's plenty of yeast that are designed to give wine a specific flavor. Think New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc or something. Like, you can buy a yeast to make a Sauvignon Blanc have that grassy taste and everything to go with that flavor profile that you're looking for. But that doesn't represent your region or your vineyard. That represents like that yeast culture promoting certain flavors. And so why do we talk about prestige vineyards? Why do we talk about vintage if we try to hide all those natural flavors? And yeah, maybe this year was hotter, so my wine has a little bit less acidity, but that was the vintage. Then we can talk about, oh, remember 2020 when it was freaking hot in California 2 weeks before harvest and everyone's sugar levels went up? I think that's better than, okay, we just added a shit ton of tartaric acid, even though that's not a bad ingredient. Like that's in wine already anyways. It's not like all these things are chemicals that will be bad for you, the things that people add to wine, but it's just not a true representation. And I think wines that are truly made from just that fruit just feel more alive and taste more interesting to me too.
Yeah. And I think, and we bring it up here whenever we talk about some of these types of producers, but people forget since the natural wine thing has come up, everybody just views anything that calls itself, low intervention or biodynamic is like this new thing, when people have been farming like this for a long time. And there are like really famous producers like DRC and Chateau Palmer in Bordeaux that are biodynamic, and nobody's get that natural wine, out of my shop. So I think it really goes into exactly what you're saying. If you put more time and care into the vineyard, there's less that you need to do in the winery to adjust. And then it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but then it comes out to your point with a more expressive wine for the most part. So
totally. Yeah. And I think to your point, like those commercial yeasts weren't invented until, I don't know, the 50s or 60s or something. Like that was a very short-lived period if you think about viticulture. And so every wine from before then was made with native yeast. And of course, then there was this generation that when all these tools became available, they thought that was revolutionary and they thought that was amazing. Oh my God, I can produce so much better wine, and wine that doesn't turn on me and that doesn't get VA or whatever it is. And I can make it taste the same every year. That's amazing. And I can also see that side when that stuff was new, but a lot of the new generation, they trying to go back to like, how did great grandpa make wine?
Yeah.
And like reverse time a little bit. And sometimes there's some tension in the family winery then where the parents just don't understand, like, why do you want to do this? We have all these tools to create, in my opinion, stellar and clean and stable wine. Like, why do you want to risk going back to like native ferments and things like that? But there's just this desire to go back to the more natural product thing. And to your point too, that doesn't mean that these wines taste like kombucha or sometimes you might drink one and you don't even know that it is natural or not, because that really doesn't, like sometimes I think people think the term natural more as like a flavor profile than a philosophy around winemaking.
Mm-hmm.
I overhear it so many times in wine bars or hear it from sommeliers that people come in and they're like, I just want a natural wine. And then they're like, what do you want? White wine, a red, an orange? Yeah, I don't know, just something natural. But that's really not a flavor. It's just, it's great that you're asking for it. There's some awareness and some demand for it. But I think to your point, yeah, I could pour you this Bordeaux and it's a natural wine, or I can pour you a Petnat with a crazy label. And for me, they would both be in natural wine because again, it's not a flavor. It's not this trend. It's not something. It's just a philosophy around farming and winemaking.
Yeah. I think you touched on something when you were mentioning going back to the way the grandfathers did it. It makes me think of like Grosvenor and Friuli too. I think it's Grosvenor, where he was making these really high quality, quote unquote, clean wines with all the technology and stainless steel. And then he went 360 and started making skin contact wines. But to your point, back when that technology was coming on, the main struggles were creating a clean wine that wasn't like flawed, making sure it finished fermentation, which is where the yeast came in. And then in Germany, hoping it was ripe enough and you got enough alcohol. So it's like then they threw everything at it at once. And now like people figured out, cool, we can like control temperature better than we used to. We don't need to like do all this other stuff or inoculate. And it's it's interesting to think about paring away what's actually needed or helpful without intervening with the wine, and how that can help the process.
Totally. And I think one thing too that I see with a lot of our producers too is sometimes you just need to give the wine more time too. There has been this expectation of, okay, harvested in whatever, September, it's in the bottle in March because we need more of this wine on the list. But maybe this wine will taste better if we bottle it after 18 months or something like that. Or it's bottled, let's leave it in the cellar, in the bottle for another year before we release it. Mm-hmm. And obviously not every winemaker has that luxury because there's obviously money constraints too, and you need to get a return on your investment. Wine is already has such a long time before you get anything back from it. If you think you plant a vineyard and then it takes 5 years before you even have any fruit that you can really do anything with. So I understand that desire to get stuff out quick, but sometimes all these things correct themselves without doing anything if you just skip the wine time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just follows its own cycle there. As we're getting closer to time here, I guess a couple things. Let's touch on what states your wines are distributed in and where people might be able to find you, and then what you're looking forward to in the next few years in terms of more producers, your own wines, etc.
Yeah. We're obviously in California. That's where we do our own distribution, and anywhere between, San Francisco down to San Diego. And then as far as other states, we are in 10 other states with distribution partners. So you can find us in Oklahoma that I mentioned earlier, Montana, Hawaii,
Illinois,
Washington, not Illinois yet, actually.
Oh, was that on your website? Sorry.
New York, Texas, Florida, and I'm really sorry if I forget someone right now. Nevada. Yeah, we're in 11 states right now, currently, and ever growing. We're hoping to launch in Oregon this year. We just launched in Arizona two weeks ago. Yeah, so ever growing. And we talked earlier about how do we find our producers, and with distribution partners, it's a little bit the same. It happens organically. Sometimes people reach out to us. Sometimes we literally meet at a bar and then we get recommended to someone, or just classic through cold calling and emailing people. But then again, there needs to be some kind of human connection there too. So we love every partner that we work with and really think that they represent our wines in those states, which is the owners of the company and be feeling so close to these wines and these producers, it's sometimes hard to be okay, here's my baby, now you run with it. But that's unfortunately also just how alcohol sales work in the US. So we could not sell to a restaurant or something in another state. It has to run through another importer and distributor.
Oh yeah. So I realized on your Instagram, you have Hawaii and Florida next to each other. I guess my random brain just put the I and the L in each other. But
hey, would love to be in Illinois. If anyone's listening, let's go.
I think it would be a great spot. One quick thing, how long did it take you to get all the necessary permits to be able to import and distribute? I know we meant to touch on that more, but it takes years, doesn't it?
Luckily, not years. We are a little bit in a better position here in California because we're a wine producing state. So laws are a little bit more relaxed. For example, we can be an importer, but also a distributor at the same time. Mm-hmm. So we because in the US, it's basically, just to touch on it quickly, a 3-tier system. You can either be a producer and importer, that's the tier 1. Tier 2 is a wholesaler and distributor. The importer and producer sells to the tier 2, the wholesaler. And then the wholesaler sells to the 3rd tier, which is on-premise or off-premise, so restaurants and retail shops. And typically one company can only occupy one of those spaces. Mm-hmm. And even my wife could technically not own a wine shop and I have a distribution company, because then within my family, we have 2 of the tiers. But in California, you can be a producer and a wholesaler, or an importer and a wholesaler. So it took us about 6 months to get all the licensing. It was pretty interesting having the really big sign that there's going to be an alcohol business opening here on our front door of our house, or on our fence. because it has to be visible to the street. So it was interesting conversations with our neighbors that thought we're opening a bar or something. And to be like, no, this is just our home office for our, but yeah, that it was about 6 months. But then selling to other states, there's typically different licensing and registration involved too. For example, we just launched in Arizona, and that also took 6 months for us to even just register as a supplier to the state of Arizona. We had to get fingerprints done and FBI background checks, and pretty intense.
Yeah, wow.
Things you need to do to be able to sell. That's just all still left over from prohibition, and luckily ending prohibition, but with the caveat of every state can just decide their own rules.
Exactly.
So we have to learn in each state from the ground up, like how can we even do this? And then we have our great partners. That's why I said I have to have a good relationship with them, because we have a lot of phone calls and back and forth even to just register and be able to sell to them.
Yeah. Wow. I'm happy you guys were able to. The wines that I was able to taste were amazing. So thank you so much for joining. I hope everybody can find your wines.
Yeah, thank you so much. Baire Wines Imports. If you turn a bottle around and it has our little bear logo on the back, then you know it's from us.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Sebastian.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. That was our interview with Sebastian Lova. I hope everybody found it really interesting. I think it's cool to hear, number one, an interesting how people get into wine, an interesting journey into wine. I think it's also interesting to identify how people choose how to build their portfolios. I think that's always a question for me. So I hope everybody goes and finds some Baire wines, look for the bear on the back of the label. And yeah, this is our episode for this week. We'll be back with another episode next week. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.